Welcome back, Honors. Wow, way to drop the ball, literally. Chidenma, good for you. All right, so anyway, let's get into it. Let's pick up right where we left off in class. We were talking about the Industrial Revolution. Specifically, we got sidetracked a little bit right before we started talking about urbanization, right? Now, Alicia brought this up in class yesterday where she was talking about, oh, is this like when they invented the mill and the plow and people were needed less? Yeah, you could say in a sense, except it's much more aggressive, right? The Industrial Revolution saw massive amounts of urbanization, huge influx of people, whereas medieval cities saw an influx of people due to the invention of the plow and the mill. But now keep in mind, the medieval era, that was in 1347 is when the plague makes landfall. So you're talking, like this is a several hundred-year difference. You've also seen massive population growth since the Black Death plague. So these urbanization movements saw a much denser movement of people into these cities, right? So, and a lot of this actually was driven by the fact that there's now constant demand for factory workers because businesses are beginning to grow. Now with the steam engine, write this down underneath this, with the steam engine, looms are now being power automated with a power loom. They're now steam powered. Factories are becoming completely mechanized, right? And so you are now seeing a giant need for workers in these factories. And these factories are all housed in larger cities, right? You also saw the growth of a lot of satellite cities outside of capitals, right? A great example of this is Manchester, United Kingdom, right? So 17,000 people lived in Manchester, United Kingdom in 1755. And by 1801, 70,000 people lived there. So that right there, statistically speaking, is just a massive, massive, massive piece of evidence about the growth of population over this time period, right? And that's all urbanization. Now, then not to mention the fact, you're also going to see a massive growth in social class systems, all right? Now, a lot of this is due to the fact that you've got entrepreneurs showing up. Capitalism's now a thing. Railroads are being laid like it's going out of style. George Stephenson invents his rocket, which is the first locomotive, right? This is a later version seen here. You've got a lot of different things going on, but the biggest thing you have is the growth of monetary holdings in the population, all right? Some of y'all are like, Mr. Terry, what does that even mean? Well, let me explain to you, my simple-minded friends. For the longest time in European history, who held all the power and the wealth? The nobility and the king or the monarchy, right? Now, post-industrial revolution, you're seeing monetary wealth and gains being held in the population themselves, and governments are pivoting and upping taxes and things like that to be able to try and accrue money on their own. This isn't like exploration when kings and queens were sending like boats out to try and find new things and new resources. This is now people, entrepreneurs, starting their own businesses on what is considered a risk, which is what capitalism all hinges on. They are risking their money and their livelihood for personal economic gain. So with this, the successful ones are now a part of a brand new social class that has never existed throughout all of history. It's called the industrial middle class. So class systems have now been forever changed, right? For the longest time, I'll draw it up here on the board real quick. For the longest time, we had like the feudal system, right? Remember when we had the feudal system there for a hot minute? Oh, the good old days. Now, feudalism. Let's go back to serfs and contracts and land binding and all that fun stuff. Yeah, that's actually not true. That was awful. Now, anyway, so feudal days, you had this, right? You had piece of crap marker. So close. All right, here we go. So in the feudal era, you had this, right? You had bang, bang, you had lords, vassals, serfs, you had the king up here, right? You had some arrows and stuff. The Industrial Revolution has changed the game a little bit. You now don't even worry about your king or your government nearly as much because you've got the growth of constitutional systems, and absolutism's kind of dying out by this point anyway, right? French Revolution proved that. Now you've got this. You've got the upper class up here, right? That's your old nobility, old money, who used to hold land. What used to be nobles are now considered your upper class. They had money when they were born, right? Now you've also got, though, the industrial middle class. Those are the business owners. They own railroads. They own private businesses. They own factories, things like that. And then you've got down here the industrial working class, or your lower class, right? Which are characterized by a lot of different things. Now, all these reasons that define the industrial working class sound super negative, but there's one key other thing we got to add in there in a second. For the most part, by modern day standards, the industrial working class was very poor. They lived in foul-smelling apartments. They usually didn't have running water, but most people didn't have running water by this point, so that's not really a good descriptor. Families as large as 20 could be living in one-room apartments, but here's the other thing on the flip side. They were also making their own money now. They were working hourly wage jobs. They were making more money. So they actually had a better ability. The industrial working class, the workers, were actually much better off than the serfs of the Middle Age, all right? So let's not completely act like, oh, no, you know what I mean? Like, there was big positives to this whole thing, right? So anyway, keep going into it. Then, though, however, we got to talk about, like, the conditions of workers during this time period. You know, you got to do what you got to do, all right? So you had two areas of which you could be working if you were a part of this industrial working class, right? You had the factories, and you had the what, Jules? The mines! Yes, very nice. If I had to pick personally, I'd probably pick the mines, simply because you make a lot more money. You know what I mean? And also factories work just seems kind of gross. But anyway, harsh conditions started in the factories. First of all, before you write anything down that goes with the harsh working conditions in the factory, we've got to talk about the first workers of factories. Jules, you were in AP Euro. Who were our first laborers in factories?
Orphans.
Orphans! Children! Because nobody wanted to work in them. Why did nobody want to work in them, Mala, AP? Why did no one want to work in the early factories?
Bad working conditions.
No.
Not safe, no?
Because they reminded them of something. They looked like something else. What did they look like? No. Why did we immediately say slaves? Like, so the factories looked a lot like, you know the answer, Jules? Yeah. Huh? Prisons and poorhouses, right? They were these huge brick buildings that had limited to no windows on them, right? You knew the conditions inside of them weren't that good. So a lot of people from the countryside are not going to leave the cottage industry and run straight to a factory and be like, I'm going to work 16 hours a day where I can't breathe and it's super hot and these machines have no safety mechanisms, so they're going to lock my hands off, right? So your earliest workers in your factories was very Dickensian, right? Dickensian, Charles Dickens, Dickensian. Very Dickensian in a sense, like your Oliver Twist novel, right? A lot of these workers were children, okay? So the machines have no safety mechanisms on them, though. Factories had no ventilation. Workers get sick, they get fired, all right? So those are your early harsh conditions in factories. Machine operators, though, also you're going to see a massive division of labor when it comes to gender, all right? Separate spheres of labor for gender. Machine operators were typically women, because they actually could use the machines easier, and the men would actually be reserved for heavy labor, particularly in the mines or shoveling coal in the factories in the steam engines below, right? So, however, these women usually got paid about half as much as a man did, right? So now you're seeing like a difference in pay based on gender. So that's pretty aggressive as well. It happened, Jules. It's factual. All right, so anyway, now really quick though, you're also going to see the mines as well. The Industrial Revolution created a much higher demand for iron and coal, right? Which has to be mined from the ground, right? If you write down in your notes, has to be mined from the ground, we should go back to like a simple science class where you learn about geology and know where iron and coal come from. Don't write things you don't need to write down, right? Miners are going to be paid a lot more, but their conditions are much more severe, right? So, and also, do not get this wrong. Up until about 1833, women were also used to work in these mines quite a bit, all right? So, conditions were much more worse, though, because you work in practical darkness, and you could easily get a disease known as black lung disease, where coal dust would actually cake up on your lungs, causing things like tuberculosis, pneumonia, and could very easily kill you. But you got paid quite a bit more, right? So, speaking of the mines, though, there was a division of labor by the mines as well. The men usually had pickaxes and were at the front of the mine called the seam, where all the coal actually exists. Women were usually used to push carts. Children were usually used to open ventilation windows, right? Then there was a massive, the middle class, the industrial middle class, the new middle class got very upset because they were like, women shouldn't be working below ground. It's dangerous. Mainly because a lot of middle class people went to go tour some mines. Do you remember this, Ma and Jules? They went to go tour the mines and stuff like that, and they got super upset because the women were working how? Topless, without shirts on, right? Because it was so hot. You know what I mean? Like, so, and they were like, you shouldn't have them down there doing that. But the women were literally like, I know most of these people, most of them are my family members, and I'm just trying to make some money. So the middle class kind of robbed the ladies of some hard work and some money. Just saying. It's messed up. All right, so now, anyway. But after about 1833, women are going to be disallowed from working in the mines after that. But they're still very dangerous conditions, right? Then you, whoa, too far. Children, though, child labor was a massive event during the Industrial Revolution as well. Children had the most dangerous jobs, if you ask a lot of different historians. I disagree with that a little bit. I think working underground in a mine on the seam, and if that thing caves in and collapses, that's pretty dangerous, right? Now, children, though, started working sometimes as early as 5, right? Now, that's at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, around the early 1700s, or mid-1700s. You could start working as early as about 5 years old. Now, as time went on, there was like the Factories Act and several other options that said, oh, well, children also had to be educated and stuff like that to actually better their working conditions. So your average age for a child laborer during the Industrial Revolution is going to be closer to somewhere probably like 10, 11, 12, right? So children, though, are used for a lot of different things. They would work in the mines hauling carts and opening air windows, right? And then also they were used to repair factory machines. Now, some of y'all are immediately thinking that, like, I'm going to open a door on a factory machine. You're just going to see little Dan Becker in there with a wrench, you know what I mean? Like going like, no, it's not what I mean, right? Most of these machines in these factories were in the textile industry, and they're giant power looms, right? They're automated. See all the looms right here? Well, all these little round things right there, they're spindles of thread, right? And the way the power looms would work is they throw the thread inside of the machine, the weft goes through it, and it just keeps making yards and yards of cloth at a very rapid rate. Well, if you've got all these individual threads running parallel to one another, sometimes those threads are going to get tangled up, right? You're going to get knots in them and stuff like that. So what a child would sometimes being used to do, their tiny, small little hands, they would actually go into the machine itself and untangle the threads and the lines so the machine could still operate without actually skipping a weft or actually another piece of thread, right? Now, due to this, though, there was no safety mechanisms on the machine. So if it turned back on and the string got wrapped around their hand, it could break their hands and sometimes also peel the skin off of their hands as it was gripping it, peeling it off almost like the skin on a banana. Like, just like, that's horrendous. Not like you pulled it out and it was like a skeleton hand. That's weird. All right. So, but like, it's bad. It hurt really bad. So, but we don't have that anymore as an issue, which is great. So what you're starting to see, though, I gave you a lot of the negatives of the Industrial Revolution on the lower class, right? But here's the thing. There are a ton of positives that actually panned out for this industrial working class as well. You now have more jobs, right? Following the invention of things like the spinning jenny, the power loom, the water frame, the seed drill, the reaper was another big one in the agricultural sector a little bit later on that harvested grain-based goods automatically. Following all these things, you're actually seeing machines replace people. So during the Industrial Revolution, you saw a giant uptick in jobs to actually provide the things necessary for these machines, right? So with more jobs goes more wages. If you have more wages, ironically enough, now there's going to be a thing that you need to write down called a consumer revolution, right? Consumerism became a thing. People began to go out and buy things because they wanted them, not because they had to have them. Many families actually before the Industrial Revolution would crowd around a single bowl and share a single spoon to eat most of their meals together. Now you can make some money in your off time and go out and buy your own spoon. Yeah, get your own spoon, all right? So the consumer revolution was a massively great thing that went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution. Also, you could buy cheap things. Costs went down, right? You had now these great new textile-based products that were actually super cheap. Underpants, yay. Underpants. You could actually go out and buy cheap underwear now, or cheap clothing, period, right? So, yeah, good stuff. You also, though, as the Industrial Revolution begins to go forward, to advocate against these harsh conditions, you saw the growth of labor unions and things like that, an organization that fights for the rights of its workers. Now, the big strategies, of course, of labor unions were strikes and boycotts, and we know that the way a labor industry would get back at them is with scabs and other things like that. But labor unions are going to be huge because they're going to begin to advocate for a worker, all right? So, now, the negatives of the Industrial Revolution, you are going to see hazardous conditions actually end up killing some people. So people like dying, right? Getting disease, right? That's another one as well. Terrible working conditions are going to be a negative. Pollution, though, is another heavy negative of the Industrial Revolution. There's actually a really great example I can show you really quick of the pollution of the Industrial Revolution, right? So let me see if I can find it. You ever heard the example, smart kids, seniors in the room, the pepper moths in England? You ever heard about these things? Okay, so there's these post-industrial revolution. There ends up being this whole issue with the pepper moths in England, right? So pepper moths used to be able to camouflage themselves perfectly into birch, I think it's birch trees, but like they used to be able to camouflage themselves perfectly onto trees to prevent themselves from actually being killed, right? But following the Industrial Revolution, ash and coal ash from all over these factories used to spew out of these stacks and they would cake all over the trees, right? So when the pepper moths would land on them, they would be easily seen by birds. So Darwin's evolution takes over. I know I'm at a Catholic school, but we can all agree that that this happened. So the darker moths, the black ones, they ended up surviving because they camouflaged into the soot-covered trees, right? So like pollution caused an evolutionary change post-industrial revolution. Oh, pepper moths, gross. Now, anyway, so then you're also going to see new ways of thinking when it comes to government and economics. Don't write the socialism thing. We're going to write that next, all right? There's a new concept that came up because you've got the industrial middle class and the upper class actually making a lot of this money, a thing called laissez-faire economics, right? Which is when the government was not allowed to intervene directly in business like associations. That is a word you're just going to have to learn and remember. Laissez-faire economics, right? Everybody needs to know that word. I'm flipping. What do you want? I'm recording a video. What do you want? No clue. He's probably off somewhere going like this. All right, so anyway, now, laissez-faire economics, you need to know it. Now, the last slide, though, is very important. 2 new government systems are going to be born of the French Revolution and of the Industrial Revolution. They're 2 isms. Does anybody in the room know what they are? Socialism and communism. Capitalism is the Industrial Revolution, Shadem. Like, get out of here. What are you thinking? Anyway, so you saw the growth of socialism and communism. The Industrial Revolution actually set up these new classes, right? Your middle class, your working class, and all these other things. And the new government were born out of them, right? Socialism was a construct that popped up and strengthened after the Industrial Revolution. All revolved around the ideas of social ownership of the means of production, right? So socialism wants to take the entrepreneur out of the factory, and they want to make it more community-owned, right? And they want to see a redistribution of the funds raised by said factory, right? So the way socialism would work is more along the lines of we would all work together in this factory and there would be no entrepreneur making most of the profits. The profits would then be redistributed to the workers themselves, right? And self-management as well is another key aspect of socialism, where basically there is no foremans, there are no bosses, there are no managers. However much you work is however much you get out of it, right? So you're actually encouraged to work that way. Now, then though, you saw communism, pioneered by your man Karl Marx in his book, The What? The Communist Manifesto. We'll talk more about communism a little bit more in depth when we get to Russia in 1917, but the big thing about communism is, derived from Karl Marx, advocates for a violent class war between 2 new classes that actually exist, all right? Well, one of them is an old class. The first one is the wealthy class that led the French Revolution, the bourgeois. And then the second one is the working class that is supposed to rise up and revolt. They are the working class known as the proletariat, right? Proletariat, proletariat, all right? So, property, though, in the communist system following the proletariat uprising is supposed to be publicly owned and state regulated, right? And each person is supposed to work and is paid according to their abilities. And in a true communist system, there is no pay, period. It's all for self-sustainment, right? Now, ironically enough, you can actually see the communist symbol right here, and it perfectly explains itself because it's supposed to be laborers uniting against the bourgeois, right? You have your agricultural workers right here in the sickle. You have your industrial workers right here in the hammer, right? So these 2 new government systems would be born of the revolution. That's the rest of your flip. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your night. Have a good one, honors. All right.
What was your